Faith is one of the most frequently discussed concepts in Christianity, yet it is often misunderstood. Many Christians think of faith primarily as belief, confidence, trust, or obedience. While each of these descriptions captures part of the biblical picture, none fully explains how Scripture portrays faith in the lives of God's people. One of the most striking observations in the Bible is that faith is presented as something that grows. Jesus spoke of both little faith and great faith. The disciples asked him to increase their faith. The Apostle Paul spoke of faith growing. These passages suggest that faith is not merely a fixed quality that some people possess and others lack. Rather, it is something that develops over time. This observation is important because many believers compare themselves to the great examples of faith found in Scripture. They look at Abraham's willingness to offer Isaac and conclude that they could never possess such trust in God. Yet this comparison overlooks an important fact. Abraham's faith at the end of his story was not the same as his faith at the beginning. The Bible presents great faith as the result of a journey rather than a starting point. For many people, that journey begins when they encounter the limits of self-reliance. Life eventually confronts every person with problems they cannot solve, losses they cannot undo, and questions they cannot answer. At some point, people discover that their own resources are insufficient. They begin looking beyond themselves, often not because they possess great confidence, but because they have exhausted other options. While this beginning may not appear impressive, it is frequently the point at which genuine faith first emerges. As people continue walking with God, dependence gradually develops into trust. They begin to learn something about His character. They discover that He is faithful, even when His actions are not always predictable or fully understood. They learn that His wisdom often exceeds their own, and that He can sustain them through difficulties they once believed would overwhelm them. Trust develops through experience. This is true in every relationship. Confidence in another person grows as they repeatedly demonstrate reliability and integrity. The same principle applies spiritually. Faith deepens as believers repeatedly encounter God's faithfulness in the circumstances of life. At this point, another important biblical observation emerges. Faith and doubt are not always opposites. Many people assume that faith requires complete certainty, yet Scripture often presents a different picture. The man who cried out to Jesus, "I believe, help my unbelief," expressed a reality familiar to many believers. Faith and uncertainty existed within him simultaneously. The issue was not the complete removal of doubt. The issue was what he chose to do despite his doubts. This distinction is important because many people wait for certainty before they act. Scripture repeatedly portrays individuals moving forward before certainty arrives. Abraham did not fully understand where God was leading him. Moses struggled with fear and inadequacy. The disciples frequently misunderstood Jesus' purposes, yet each continued moving forward despite unanswered questions. This leads to one of the most practical insights regarding spiritual growth. Trust deepens through decisions. Every believer eventually encounters moments when God's way and alternative paths stand before them. One option appears safer, another appears easier, another appears more reasonable. Complete certainty is unavailable, yet a choice must still be made. Many people assume that such decisions merely reveal the amount of faith already present. In reality, they often contribute to its growth. When a believer chooses God's path despite uncertainty, they create an opportunity to discover whether God is truly trustworthy. When God proves faithful, confidence deepens. That deeper confidence influences future decisions, creating a cycle of growth. Trust leads to decision. Decision leads to experience. Experience leads to greater trust. The cycle then begins again. This pattern helps explain why God often develops faith through lived experience rather than simply providing more information. Information can tell someone that a bridge is strong. Confidence develops when they walk across it. Information can describe a trustworthy person. Trust grows when that trustworthiness is repeatedly demonstrated. Similarly, God often builds faith through experience rather than explanation alone. The life of Abraham illustrates this pattern clearly. When most people think of Abraham, they think of Isaac on Mount Moriah. Yet that event cannot be understood apart from the decades that preceded it. Abraham experienced fear, failure, uncertainty, delay, and disappointment. He made significant mistakes. He waited years for promises to be fulfilled. Nevertheless, he continued returning to God's promises. Over time, Abraham accumulated something he did not possess at the beginning of his journey, a history of God's faithfulness. By the time he reached Genesis 22, he was not acting on blind confidence. He was acting on decades of experience. His trust had been shaped by repeated encounters with God's reliability. This observation highlights another important aspect of mature faith: memory. Throughout Scripture, God's people are repeatedly instructed to remember. They are told to remember God's deliverance, His provision, His promises, and His faithfulness. Remembering is not merely an exercise in recalling information. It is a means of strengthening trust. Present confidence is often built upon past experiences of God's faithfulness. As faith matures, another transformation occurs. Initially, many people turn to God because they have nowhere else to go. Later, they remain committed because they become convinced that His way is best. This is a significant shift. Early faith often emerges when alternatives have failed. Mature faith increasingly chooses God even when alternatives remain available. Comfort, security, control, and easier paths may still exist. However, experience has taught the believers something about God's character. They have learned that His wisdom is superior to their own, that His promises are more reliable than appearances, and that His purposes lead to life. In this sense, trust eventually becomes preference. The alternatives have not disappeared. They simply no longer appear as trustworthy as God's way. This understanding helps explain why Scripture consistently directs attention toward God's character. Faith does not grow primarily through effort alone. It grows as people learn who God is. The more clearly believers see His faithfulness, wisdom, patience, and goodness, the more willing they become to trust Him. The more they trust Him, the more opportunities they have to experience His faithfulness. And the more they experience His faithfulness, the deeper their trust becomes. When viewed in this way, faith is not primarily a state of certainty. It is a growing confidence in God's character that develops through experience, decisions, remembrance, and repeated discoveries of His faithfulness. Little faith becomes great faith, not because some people are born with extraordinary trust, but because ordinary people learn, one step at a time, that God is trustworthy.